Hi, I'm Gareth Green, and in this video we're going to have a think about how to use augmented 6th chords in major keys. So first of all, let's be absolutely sure about how an augmented 6th chord is put together. And I think the easiest way of doing this is just to follow a fairly simple recipe. There are lots of different ways of forming one of these augmented 6th chords, but here's a way that I'm going to suggest that I think is fairly straightforward. So we're going to work in the key of C major. It just makes life a little bit easier, and then you can transfer this recipe to any key that you want to work in. So in the key of C major, we're going to start by finding the lowered 6. So in C major is the scale of C, the 6th degree of the scale is A. So let's take A, we'll put that in the bass, and we're going to lower it by a semitone or a half step. So we get A flat, okay? Call it A flat rather than G sharp, so we don't get involved in confusing N harmonics. So there's A flat as the lowered 6. Above that note, we now need to go up an augmented 6. So an augmented 6 above A flat is F sharp. Okay, so A flat, F sharp. Then we put the tonic in the middle. Well, we're in the key of C, so the tonic C, and there's C, and there is the generic augmented 6th chord. Okay, now if I just use those 3 notes as the generic augmented 6th chord, it's also known as an Italian 6. So I might decide to double that C in another part or not, but that's confirming it as an Italian 6. If I add another note to the Italian 6, it will become a French 6. So what I'm going to do now is to add D to what we already had, because D is an augmented 4th above the bottom note. So we've got A flat at the bottom, an augmented 4th above that is D. So I've got my A flat, the lowered 6, I've got F sharp, the augmented 6 above that bottom note, I've got the tonic in the middle, and now I've added an augmented 4th above the root of the chord, that D. That's a French 6. Now, instead of that D, I could have E flat in the middle of the chord, okay? And that turns it into a German 6. So whatever I'm doing, I'm holding on to that original generic chord, the A flat, the F sharp with the C in the middle. As I say, we can add another C, call it Italian. We can add that D, an augmented 4th above the bass, and call it French. Or instead of the D, I can add E flat and call it German. And E flat is a perfect 5th above the A flat at the bottom. So those are the 3 forms of augmented 6. Now, you can have augmented 6 chords that are formed on the lowered 2nd degree of the scale, but this is the most common use of them. If you want to form them on the lowered 2nd degree of the scale, you can form them in exactly the same way using, in this case, D flat as the lowered 2nd as your starting point, but you'd build the chords in the same way. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to stick to the most obvious place in which these things get used. And we'll mix and match a little bit as we go in terms of whether we're using Italian, French, or German. Now, the real purpose of this video is, having sorted out what the augmented 6th chords are, is to work out how do we approach them and how do we leave them? Because it's all very well to think, great, I now know what an augmented 6th chord is, but where do I use it? It's a chromatic chord. It's not one of what we call the diatonic chords. The diatonic chords being just the ordinary chords that belong to the key. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They're the diatonic chords because they're using notes that are inside the key. Chromatic chords are often using notes that don't belong to the key, like we're talking about A flats and F sharps and all these things. Nothing to do with the key of C major, but nevertheless, it's a chromatic chord in C major because it's using these other notes, but it functions in the key of C major. So you can approach it from a chord in C major, you can leave it with chords in C major. So it has a function in C major, and the purpose of a chromatic chord is simply to add a bit of colour, bit of drama to the music, to do something that's slightly less predictable. So they're really useful chords to add into the mix. Let's have a think about how we resolve them, how we leave them. Now, these chords are often known as predominant chords. So I could have one of my augmented 6th chords, here's an Italian, and I could follow it with chord 5. Or I could do that with the others. There's a French followed by 5. Works perfectly well. So going on to chord 5, good progression. Quite often we interrupt that resolution to 5 by using chord 1 in second inversion. So we might have one of the augmented 6th chords, here's a German in this case, there's a German 6, and then I'm going 1C onto chord 5. So 1C, 1 in second inversion, onto chord 5. Those are the most common resolutions. Now you might say, well, I've found some other wonderful resolution. That's great, you can do that. You can also do rather clever things with them. For example, I could take the German 6 and then I could say I'm going to rename this F sharp G flat, and then it becomes a dominant 7th in the key of D flat major. So you could wander off into another key. So they're loaded with possibilities, but for the moment we're just thinking about what's the normal approach and resolution. So resolution, use your augmented 6th chord, follow it with 5, or follow it with 1 in second inversion followed by 5. And now what we're going to do is consider possible approach chords. So when I look at example number 1 here, I'm going to use chord 1 as an approach chord. Then you can see I've got a German 6. Then I've got my 1 in second inversion and my 5. So what does that sound like? It's a pretty solid progression, doesn't it? It works pretty well. Obviously, between chord 1 and the augmented 6, we've got this note C in common. So that's useful. If you can use common notes and sound them in the same part, going from one chord to the next, that often smooths the progression. So I can do that. In the alto part, well, I'm just moving down a semitone. In the tenor part, I'm just moving down a semitone. Okay, the bass part has quite a leap going up a minor 6. If you have a big leap in one direction, try to mitigate it by going by step in the opposite direction. So that's what I've done, big leap, and then just step down a semitone, a half step. So that progression seems to me to work pretty well. Okay, so that's chord 1. In the second example, we're looking at an approach from chord 2. And this time, just for variety, we've got an Italian 6 being used there, and this time we're going to go straight on to chord 5 without using that chord 1 in second inversion first. So here's 2, and then followed by the augmented 6, followed by 5. Also sounds all right, doesn't it? Now you can look at that and say, well, we haven't really got any common notes there, but we have got an F natural in 2, and we've got an F sharp in the augmented 6th chord. So they work quite nicely in the same part, because then you get this semitone movement. And having gone up a semitone, I've gone up another semitone. So the whole progression is really very smooth at the top. The alto part in this case, well, I'm going up a third and then just stepping down, so that's all right. The tenor part steps down, steps back up again, so that's fine. And in the bass part, you've got this slight awkwardness that we're going from a D to an A flat. So a melodic tritone is not something that we kind of go out of our way to use. However, it's pretty difficult. If you're going to go from 2 onto an augmented 6, what can you do? Because 2 to the root of an augmented sixth is going to be a tritone. So you can't do anything about it. And it doesn't sound at all bad, actually, when you put it with the stepwise motion of the upper parts. And again, having had that angular leap there, step back inside it if you can, and it works perfectly well. So you put that together, you get this. Seems pretty good, doesn't it? Okay, well, in the third example, I'm going to consider chord 3 as an approach chord. Now, chord 3 is one of those chords, you know, in textbooks, you're often advised to sort of avoid chord 3. You know, chord 7 is the most awkward chord. Chord 3 is not much better, so you might as well avoid it. It's a strange piece of advice, really, because you're not going to overuse chord 3 in a major key. It's a bit more troublesome in a minor key, but in a major key, actually, chord 3 sometimes works quite well. So don't overdo it, but it's a distinct possibility. Well, in this case, I'm using chord 3 followed by another Italian, and I'm going on to the chord 5. How does that sound? Well, you may decide it doesn't sound quite as good as going from chord 1 or chord 2, but it's not ghastly. Slightly funny leap in the bass, isn't it? Going from E to A flat there, but again, mitigate it by stepping back within the leap. It's not too bad. The soprano part works quite smoothly, doesn't it, there, which is quite nice. And the alto part works quite smoothly with a bit of contramotion between those top two parts. So actually it makes for a nice progression, doesn't it? And the tenor part, absolutely fine. It's just that slightly awkward thing in the bass. But 3 is a possibility. Whether it's going to be your strongest choice, that's up to you. You might think, actually, I'd be better off to do something else other than 3, but don't write it off completely. Okay, let's have a look at example 4. And here I'm using chord 4 as the approach chord. And I'm also doing something else here just to show you another possibility. I'm using a German 6 here, but I've put it in a different inversion. Can you see I've put F sharp in the bass? It's perfectly possible to use augmented 6th chords in inversion. You have to be a little bit careful about them, but I've just done it here just to show the possibility and to suggest why I'm doing it here. Because can you see I get a lovely semitone or half step movement in the bass going from F to F sharp to G. And I can also get this nice semitone movement going in contramotion with the soprano, A to A flat to G. So contramotion between top and bottom parts, often a good thing. But here you get this wonderful opportunity to do this movement by half step or semitone, contramotion. And that's a great move. Also, I've got a common note because I've got C in chord 4. I've got C in the augmented 6, so using the common note in the same part, and then it can move on by step. And the alto part is kind of going nice and smoothly as well. So those are reasons in this case why I decided to use a German 6 in a different inversion. So I'm not saying you always have to do that from chord 4, but it's just a nice progression if you're going from 4 through the augmented 6 onto 5, that you can generate that semitonal movement, half step movement. Other possibilities, of course, exist. Now, when we go on to example 5, you can see that this time I'm approaching from chord 5. And of course, I'm showing you that you can resolve to 5 as well. So in this case, we're starting and finishing with 5. Okay, how does that sound? It's got a nice kind of symmetry about it in a way, isn't it? You know, using 5 as bookends either side. And I've used a French 6 in this case. You can see the French 6 is going on there. But that's quite nice because the alto part is able to repeat the same note. So we're using common notes there. And we're going down 1, back up again, up 1, back down again. So we're able to do that contramotion chromatic movement between the outer parts, and the tenor parts just going up one and coming down one, nice parallel thirds with the bass part. Quite a smooth progression. So that's definitely a possibility. Okay, in example 6, we're showing how you can approach from chord 6. Well, is chord 6 the best option? Well, certainly it's got its merits. You see the bass part again going down in semitones or half steps, which is quite useful. Again, we've got a common note in the tenor there, those two C's, and then it's moving on by step. We've got a common note in the alto between this French 6 and the chord 5 that follows. So quite a lot to do with common notes. There's one thing that's a little bit uncomfortable about the approach from 6, and it's this. If I end up with an A in another part and then I get A flat in the bass, well, that is giving me false relations. So false relations are usually best avoided. Is there a way of getting around it? Yes, there can be, but it's not easy. You can end up writing consecutives or end up with chords that don't sound brilliantly spaced. So is it possible to approach from 6? Well, it is, but you might pay the price of either funny spacings of chords or note omissions, or you might end up with false relations. So probably 6, not the ideal approach, but it's possible. This is what it sounds like. So it sounds perfectly all right, with just that slight reservation about the false relation. You hear that? We mitigate the false relation by having this stepwise movement in the bass, but it's just slightly uncomfortable, isn't it? Okay, and in the last example we've got here, you might already in your own mind have written off the possibility of using chord 7. It's a diminished chord, it's often troublesome, but I'm going to use 7 here, but you'll notice that I'm using 7B. Why am I doing that? 7 in first inversion. Simply because when you have a diminished chord, it sounds a bit ugly in root position. It's not a great sound. And the main reason for it sounding ugly is that you get this tritone between the bottom and the top of the triad. So you can mitigate that by putting it in first inversion. As soon as you put it in first inversion, it just sounds a heap better. So 7 in first inversion, followed in this case by an Italian 6, and straight on to the dominant chord, chord 5. Well, that's a better progression than some of you might have thought when I first suggested 7. Is it the most obvious progression? Well, 7B as an approach is not the most obvious approach to an augmented 6, but does it work? Well, yes, it does. You know, the soprano's going by step, nice chromatic rising movement in the alto, the tenor's going by step. We've got this slightly awkward customer again in the bass where you get your tritone, but mitigated by all that careful movement in the upper parts, and also mitigated because having had that leap, we step back inside it by step. So that's 7B. So having listened to all those approaches, you might well have your favourites. And you might have already decided, well, I'm not going to bother by using 3 or 7B or something. That's entirely up to you. You might have slight reservations about approaching from 6. That's fine. Doesn't really matter at all. But it's just to show the possibilities of what we can do so that you can feel a bit more confident, not only knowing what an augmented 6th chord is, but actually how you might use it. How do you approach it? How do you resolve it? And if you've enjoyed this video and you want to find out more about such things, you could have a look at our advanced theory course at www.mmcourses.co.uk. Or if you want to do something more practical with all this stuff, you could go to the keyboard harmony course we've got there. Or if you want to really get your ear tuned into this stuff, you might be interested in the oral dictation course. Many other courses to have a look at there, so you might want to have a route around the website, see what you can find. While you're on there, do click on Maestros on the homepage, because Maestros is our international community of musicians. Wonderful group of people, all really supportive, and lots of perks that come with being a member of Maestro, including discounts on courses and the opportunity to meet for our monthly live streams, where I try to inject a strong dollop of teaching content, and then we have another group where people can submit their own work, compositions, arrangements, harmony, recorded performances, whatever you want to, and you can receive some kind of personal evaluation and feedback, and we share that within the group. So it's a marvellous group, Maestros, and do come and join us if you'd like to.